Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. As always, I'm your host, Deb Ryan. On this episode, I sat down with John Friedman. John is an author, a speaker, and an advisor on all things sustainability. John has been working with companies in the sustainability space for decades. And as part of our conversation, we talk about how John's career pivoted into sustainability in the first place, how he's really been part of really ensuring that culture and community help build trust and allow companies to think about their supply chain beyond just their own business, but also thinking about how businesses think about sustainability on their bottom line and not just as a separate entity. This is the last episode of the season as we take a break for the summer. I want to thank all of my guests that I've had on this season, as well as all of you, the listeners. And I'll be working on getting together to bring more speakers after this summer. To stay on top of all new episodes, please make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. But for now, sit back and enjoy my conversation with John. Hey everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Navigating Carbon. Today I'm joined by John Friedman. John, how are you?
I am well, and how about yourself?
I'm doing well as well. I'm so glad that you could join me today. I'm excited to tease out some of the things you've been working on and your kind of career and journey in the decarbonization and sustainability space. So I thought we might actually just start there. Like, I'd love for you to give folks around like a little bit of that context of like how you got into decarbonization and sustainability and a little bit of your story.
Yeah, sure. And I'll try to keep this brief because I started this over 25 years ago before this was this, right? Before sustainability, it had been talked about since the late 60s, but it wasn't really a thing. And so we were kind of inventing it as we went along. I got into it because I'd done one project for my company, which was the North American subsidiary of a French company. And then this new thing came over from the parent company, and they were like, give it to John because he succeeded on the last project. And very quickly, I seized on the idea that what we were talking about was not another, 6 week or 6 month initiative from corporate, and then the next flavor of the month would show up, but rather a real cultural change that they were trying to instill within the company, but then also within the larger context of the world around it, in terms of how the company saw its role as a company in the world, if that makes sense.
It does.
And so it combined environmental, social, and economic because the whole idea was, sustainability. We have to sustain this company, leverage the power of the company to do these things in a way and run our business in a way that was more efficient, less carbon intensive, less energy, less water, less waste, but also at the same time focusing on safety and well-being of the employees and the people in our work sites, but then as well with the use of the product.
There's so many pieces to that because, like, when you say you've been doing this for 25 years, right? Like, I've really only been playing in this space for about 5 years, and again, I still get people being like, "Oh, you've been doing this for so long," and it's like, "No, I haven't." Like, there's definitely people like yourself who've been doing this for a lot longer, and yet we still sort of feel like we're building the plane as we're flying. To be honest, like, there's constantly new things popping up and stuff. So it's really I'm really excited to dive in today about some of your like the things that you've worked on and the lessons and stuff, and I'd love you to tease out a little bit, like, it is really around this cultural piece for companies, like, um, it just talk a little bit about, like, the lessons learned from that and the evolution of that a little bit. I'm sort of fascinated about that in terms of just I've had this conversation with other people as well about how this isn't necessarily just a policy and things, and we're gonna talk into, like, some of the pieces as well. When you can sort of tie it to economic benefits and things, it's much easier for companies to sort of adopt these things. But the cultural piece is really important. Like, I'm just yeah, I'd love kind of you to pull that apart a little bit more and how that evolved. Like,
Yeah, it's a concept that I call what you make is not what you do.
I like
What
that.
you make are the products or the services you provide, but what you do is really the impact that they have on people's lives or on the community or on the planet writ large. And so it's a real shift in the mindset from where, in this case, it was the largest producer of cement, concrete, aggregate, wallboard, and asphalt, the construction materials, to we're building a better world. And our stuff builds the world. And that it has a benefit to the world of having our products and services in the world. but that there's also the balance sheet idea that there's a cost to it as well. And how do you minimize the cost, not just financially and impact on people's lives, but also impact the negative impacts on the environment? So building a bridge can stitch two communities together, but if you do it right, it also doesn't pollute the water that both communities on either side of that valley use to live and to grow their food or to drink. And so it's that it's somewhat esoteric in that mindset, but it's at the same time very much focused on business.
Did you find that, like, both the employees, but also, like, the stakeholders and stuff like that responded really well to that kind of, like, vision, I guess, at the end of the day? You'd call it a vision? Or
It,
yeah.
well, call it a vision. Well, we called it, the Lafarge way. It was the way
Okay.
Lafarge was going to be in the world, and we tied it to what we called our principles of action. And the interesting thing is, I found that the senior executives kind of got it, and the very frontline employees really got it. It was from one of the frontline employees who really said what got him to come to work in the morning was the idea that we were building the houses that people would live in, the hospital where their children would be born, the schools where their kids would be educated, the house of worship where they might one day get married and start their own families, the offices where they would provide for their families, and the roads that you use to get between them. And that came from an employee.
It's
And
cool.
that's a powerful vision rather than the number of cubic yards, cubic feet, or cubic meters, or what have you, or other even financial metrics of what you're doing. And so we tied what we were doing to the impact we were having on people's lives. The first thing I did was I built a partnership with Habitat for Humanity, which had the similar vision to the company, which is we want to put decent, safe, affordable housing around as many people in the world. And so that really tied into that vision. And it became something, a pride point for the employees, a passion point, if you will, for why go to work every day. And, what is what I'm doing today contributing to that, rather than just contributing to the bottom line or contributing to the paycheck, but I'm actually doing good and the company doing well. And the better the company does, the more good we're doing. And that's
Yeah.
very powerful. It was the middle managers who, until we changed this incentive programs, who weren't rewarded for things like that and thinking like that and doing that, who had the hardest time shifting from, oh, that's all well and good, but the bottom line is the bottom line. But if you could tie it to, if we reduce um, the amount of energy we use. We reduce the amount of water. That directly improves your P&L. If we reduce the amount of raw materials we're putting in, that reduces your profit and loss statement. But if we do it in a way that is safe, that reduces your lost time accidents, that reduces your insurance premiums, that reduces potential lawsuits, what have you. And so you started to tie it to the objectives the company already had. Rather than getting them interested in sustainability as what can you do to be more sustainable, it's what can sustainability do to make the business work better for you according to the objectives that the company has already set.
I love that. So, like, thinking then about, like, from this sort of first project that you took on that was sort of a whole evolution
Mhm.
and shift and stuff, like, you then kind of went into consulting and working with a lot of other companies and stuff like that. Like, just sort of for folks, just sort of that evolution and, like, just high level kind of some of the kind of stuff. And was it sort of similar to that kind of just work that you were doing, thinking about these economic metrics and stuff like that? But just curious to that sort of evolution of your journey as well.
Yeah, so thank you for that because I developed the model when I worked in one company and I used it in a number of companies successfully. And then the consulting company reached out to me based on a book I'd written, which included this progression of how you really start it, and become exemplary at it. Um, and just talking to me, they said, this is not the way most people talk about this. They talk about, climate change or global warming or melting ice caps or social justice. You're talking about it from a business framing. And we think our clients will want to hear that. So I have five key elements that I say a program has to have. It has to align with and support your overall strategy. It has to be compatible with your day-to-day business reality. It has to empower and engage employees, and that's your cultural aspect. I started out by saying you had to have tangible, measurable results. You had to be able to prove you were doing the good you said you were doing and having the results the proof is in the pudding. Are we improving the bottom line? Are we reducing costs? Are we improving the air quality? Are we improving water and so forth? And the last part was stakeholder engagement, which is bringing other people in, and helping them understand that why you're doing this is really not about, if you will, brand and impression management, but really about how do you run a business in the 21st century when people expect businesses, they understand the massive impact business has, but the societal expectation of what a business is and how it runs has evolved from back in the 50s where, you had people working 7 days a week and long hours. The contract between society and business has evolved, and people want the businesses. They have an expectation that businesses will run in a manner they consider to be responsible business.
No, I love that. And so, like, thinking about, some of the companies that you've worked for and stuff like that, like, just talk a little bit about how that mindset shift around, particularly, like, we'll start with the economic drivers and stuff. Like, you sort of showed a little bit or talked a little bit about that first kind of like middle management shift. But where have you really seen big sort of changes and step forwards in that, with the work that you've now done over the last, several years and decades?
Well, the beauty of it is that this work works, right? When we were doing it, we were, estimating, and we were trying to figure out. And one of the things we learned is you couldn't overestimate. If you tell someone you're going to save 5% off their bottom line and you say 4.9%, they're disappointed. But if you say you can do more than three, then they come back and say, well, you didn't even realize the impact you were going to have. And so it's a matter of how do you not make it seem too good to be true. Worked with Sodexo for many years in our food waste initiative. We estimated massive savings that we literally thought we could double the profitability of the company. But if you go to the CEO and you say that, first of all, they'll laugh you out of the room if it seems too good to be true. And second of all, they'll hold you to it, which is an interesting paradox, right? So I always say you get the low hanging fruit, get the quick wins, solve the problems that the business already acknowledges. So at Lafarge, the Habitat partnership became a real pride point, and it really tied what the company did into good in the world. At the same time, we were struggling to hire people. At the time, a lot of the engineers were going to the dot coms. They could pay better, but we felt that research showed that younger people coming into the workforce were values driven, and that mattered more to them than necessarily their salary for a large segment of them. And so by pulling the value lever they already had, we solved HR's problem.
Yep. Yeah, right? Like, and without even realizing that you were gonna probably do that necessarily. So it's just,
Well,
yeah.
Well, it became the largest recruitment thing we had, and
Mm,
it
that's
used
cool.
to ask people, where did you first learn about the company? What was the first thing that you noticed about the company? And we ended up started with other, we talked about, people came to our school, ads in papers, what or trades or what have you. And then other people started filling in the Habitat partnership. That we started asking specifically about Habitat partnership as one of the choices, which also served to educate people that we had one.
That's cool. Yeah.
And then we used it at trade shows. I remember we built and designed one booth where every single image in the booth demonstrating all the products we had and services we provided, every single image was a Habitat for Humanity build.
Oh, that's cool. It's a really nice integration of then actually demonstrating, to your point, like you talked about metrics, right? Like, it's a really good way of showing some of those metrics, even that are maybe not tangible in that, like, exactly like monetarily tangible and things like that. So, which is really cool. So, like, one of the things I hear a lot when I talk to folks and stuff, particularly on the like day-to-day business pace, which you talked about, like how do companies think about tying that? Like, a lot of the initiatives and a lot of the things I hear about often come from employees that have been like engaged and sometimes incentivized to think outside the box a little bit, to really think about like how they're doing their day to day and how they can do it differently. Like, is that is that evolution something you've experienced as well? Is that way, or have you seen that day-to-day tie come from other places as well? Like, I'm just kind of curious about that piece as we dive through these.
A lot of it comes from the employees, gets to the empower and engage employees. When I first started out, There was no such thing as employee resource groups where
Okay.
employees were pulled together based on some commonalities that they had or were perceived to have had, and empowered to inform the organization about the issues they were feeling and hearing about or caring about. That all started out with employees actually meeting outside the business somewhat, the same way the labor movement started with sort of these sidebar and secretive conversations and groups that formed informally and would then try to change the company from within versus complain about it to each other. And at some point over the 80s and 90s, companies recognized if we empower these groups, if we create these groups, these people won't be complaining about us to their friends and their colleagues and potentially leaving the company if they get frustrated, and instead calling them employee resource groups. And, that's the whole network groups. And, I've seen them based on ethnicity, gender, age,
Yeah,
cultural
like book
background, what have you.
clubs, like sporting
Exactly.
things, like all sorts of different things now. Like, yeah.
Or veterans or
Yeah.
parents is a big one because a lot
Yeah.
of the issues in today's workforce are how do you marry and or manage a career and a family. Well, the best way to do that is to ask your employees what they need, and don't just assume. I worked for one company. We had a telecommuting program where you could telecommute two or three times a week, but it was based on you had to maintain a good performance, and you had to have good communication with your boss, and your job had to be one that could be done that way. And we asked our employees, and the research, it was kind of groundbreaking when we did it. People may have made assumptions, but about, who working from home was more important to. Young mothers, for example, was one that people expected. Well, you know what we found out? There was
What?
no correlation. There was no
Okay.
correlation to gender. There was no correlation to age.
Interesting.
The not surprising correlation was to amount of time commuting. People valued their time to do whatever, whether it was with their kids, with their family, by themselves, doing sports or after work, what activities. And the longer it took you to get home or to get to those activities, the more you valued not having to drive in every day or take public transit every day. That was the correlation. And when you look at it now, you say, that's obvious. Someone who commutes 10 minutes cares much less than someone who commutes an hour and a half each way.
Yeah. Makes a huge impact. Yeah. That makes sense. No, and I love that. And so, like, as we think about, metrics and tying things to, as you were looking at, sustainability and decarbonization, like, did you find that some of those initiatives as well, like, also then came from employees and were able to make some of those really interesting ties through those resource groups or even just through their own operational teams and some of that kind of stuff as well?
Yeah, absolutely through their
Yeah.
teams. If you want to know how to make your fleet of vehicles more efficient, ask the people who manage your fleet because they're accountable to how much fuel, what you're spending on fuel. And if you give them the tools, if you think about it, if you own a car, if it suddenly starts getting worse mileage, you know that something may be going wrong with that vehicle. You need to do something, and whether it's inflating your tires better or getting it tuned up or fixing something before it breaks down, you get that immediate feedback. But if you're managing a fleet of several thousand vehicles, you don't have that data. You
You're just
can't
looking at
see it.
spreadsheets. Yeah. Like,
But if in the sustainability metrics, we are measuring fuel consumed, because we're calculating emissions associated with fuel. And we are doing it by using the credit card receipts from every driver which was assigned a vehicle. We can sit there and say, wait a minute, that vehicle is getting worse mileage than all the like vehicles in that geography. There's the vehicle that might be a problem. You could do the same thing with equipment. You can do the same thing across the larger the company, the more data you have. If you bring that data in real time, you can use it to make their job easier, their life easier, because nobody wants a breakdown of, let's say, a piece of essential equipment for production. You say, it's using 30% more diesel than the like machine um, in a similar temperature area because temperature affects
question
motor
and stuff.
combustion efficiency. But we could be taking that data from around the world and say, we're seeing something here, check into it. We're not telling them what to do. We're saying, you want to check machine number 45. That person goes and now they're rewarded by their boss for being a genius for figuring out that that machine was on the cusp of breaking down. And now they can wait till it's out of service regularly, do the maintenance then, and not lose any production time.
Yeah. And suddenly then those metrics flowing directly, like you said, tying to the day to day, thinking about like the right metrics, and they've, yeah, created like a huge win on the P&L and the bottom line. So it's like, it's a really nice example of that. Like, have you found, as we collect more data and, as you worked with different companies and stuff as well, like, have you found that the metrics have evolved and stuff, or have we just got more data to put into them? I don't know. Like, I'm curious about that evolution as well.
Well, a lot of the metrics are estimates based on, the best information that was available. But as we put more data in, you get better information. One of the classic examples is for a natural gas company, the amount of gas, the emissions associated with the distribution system are based on the material the pipe is made of and how long the pipe is, which is a factor that the Environmental Protection Agency and there's other models around the world use to estimate how much gas will leach out through, clad steel versus, the new plastic pipes, which leak less, mostly because they have fewer joints. But anyway, but that's good data. But better data is real-time data. You can literally measure your lost and unaccounted for gas going in and out of the pipe, or you can use satellites now going over, and they can, because of the composition and the mercaptan that gets put into natural gas, they can literally, go fly over and see where those leaks are. And so now you're getting real-time direct measurement versus estimated data. So the data's gotten better. At the same time, the call for better data, I used to say tangible, measurable results. Now I say consistent, comparable, and decision useful data
Oh, I like
because
that.
and the idea, and I got that from the the consulting firm I worked with, because it also had assurance and auditing as part of its model, and say, this stuff needs to be assured. And I've been calling for assurance for this stuff for 15 years, because if you say you've done something, like with the Habitat partnership, we could point to the houses that we built with our materials. We had the names, the addresses, the number of people in it, the number of children, people under the age of 18, and we had that data because Habitat would give it to us and we could report it, and we could report it locally. So we say, we've done 10 houses, we've done 15, we've done 150, people could see it. And we had ways of demonstrating it. But when you're doing things like, and this is the real issue with carbon credits, how are you sure that you purchase the carbon credit, that, and the chain of custody, if you will, of the data? And so we're seeing more and more call for more and more robust um, assurance on the data, as well as more direct measurement where possible. And, interestingly enough, over 90% of the comments to the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, when they proposed climate disclosure, were in favor of climate disclosure. They wanted it maybe different ways, or do we include scope 3 and how much of scope 2 and so forth. But overwhelmingly, the investors want this because they want data that they can use to make a decision. Are you managing your physical risks associated with sea level rise, or with changing weather patterns, or more frequent storms or droughts? How are you managing that as part of your business? That data is now seen not as an externality, but it's seen as actual material data for evaluating how well a business is run, the
Yeah.
governance side of it.
It is a really interesting evolution in that space, because and it's something I've been looking a lot at recently around how is sort of like environmental performance and metrics tied to operational and therefore economic performance. There's more and more kind of conversations around that, and it's an interesting kind of. I don't know if tension's the right word. I'm curious as to your thoughts on this around the investors, to your point, who are like, no, we want to be able to compare company A and company B, with similar metrics and the same kind of information, compared to just what people are voluntarily publishing, versus there still seems like there's a lot of resistance from companies to provide that information, even though more and more of them are doing it voluntarily. But I don't know, I'm curious as to your tension or your thoughts around like the tension that exists in that space around, w- you know, how that's going to go and how it has evolved a little bit, as you've
Yeah.
been looking at it.
Well, what I like to say is, this time the call's not coming from inside the house, right? Companies that have been doing this recognize the value of doing this. Um, and I always said there's a difference between things that you measured and things that you reported. There are a lot of times you say to a company, look, we want to measure this. we want to understand this for our own business intelligence reasons. We're not compelled to disclose this. And issues like pay parity as it relates to gender. Companies are very frightened of being forced to justify their salaries and to prove that they're not discriminating against women or any other group based on anything other than merit, longevity, and contribution to the bottom line. But I've worked with a couple companies where we've measured it, and we have actually discovered that the companies were doing what they wanted to do, where they could document that it was related to performance. Now, of course, say that, evaluations are subjective and they are, so it's still not a perfect science, but it's an improved science. But it at the same time does help a business to run better because they know and understand this as intelligence for how they're running their own business. And you can do that with the fuel consumption thing. If you don't have to report the emissions associated with it, or you don't feel like you want to, um, you can still use that information to maximize efficiency. At the same time, there's more and more pull from outside the market is wanting this information, whether it's investors or your customers, because they've committed to it. And yes, there's been a pushback recently, particularly in the U.S. from the administration. But the data shows anywhere between 85 and 75 to 85% of companies are still doing sustainability, and 50% of companies are maintaining the course, but 25% are taking the opportunity that they see the competitive advantage. My competitor is moving away from this. I'm going to push harder on this because I know this is what my customers want, my investors want, my employees want, what communities want. It'll make me more favored in the long run. And the government, if they're not your primary customer, I mean, obviously you don't want to run afoul of regulations, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. Just because they're not required and compelled to do it doesn't mean you can't do it. And if it's proven itself as a business model, then it's worth doing because it's proven itself. And if it needs to undergo a little bit of scrutiny in order to make sure that it is aligned with the strategy, day-to-day operations, providing measurable improvements and engaging your employees and your stakeholders, a little bit of scrutiny doesn't hurt. I think it's like steel gets tempered by heat. We have to be willing to look at what we're doing and not say, well, it's right because it's right because we know it's right or we feel it's right. It has to pass the litmus test of, is it doing what we set out to do?
Yeah. No, I think it's so important. And I think the piece around minimum regulation is also always an interesting one to me because it feels like there is a number of companies out there who would like to get rid of regulations and just do things based on minimum regulation. But more and more, I think there is, I definitely have seen a shift where companies aren't necessarily, where there's lots of different state regulations and, I would say even sort of like 5, 10 years ago, companies would just go to the minimum standard in those states. Whereas now I find when I talk to companies, they're saying, okay, what's the strictest that we have across any of the states we operate in? And we'll employ that everywhere. And so more and more, I feel like I've seen that shift where it's not, companies are going, a lot of companies are going above and beyond minimum regulation in certain places and things, which, it sort of ties to what you were talking about, where it's like companies are seeing that there is value in doing that. And I think that has been a really interesting shift over the last definitely 5 to 10 years in the decarbonization space. I don't know if you've seen the same thing.
Absolutely, and it makes perfect sense whether you're talking about a multinational or you're talking about, a single country-based uh, organization. So think about the automobile manufacturers. If they have to meet an emissions or a fuel economy standard, let's say for California, do you build separate factories with separate equipment and separate processes for cars that aren't sold in California? Or do you sit there, or do you have a safety program only in certain places? Or do you take the best of all worlds, recognizing, of course, that if you meet the standards of regulation, you're not going to different. You may stay out of the courtroom, but you won't be in people's hearts and minds either, and you won't be the preferred supplier or the preferred customer, because unless every one of your competitors is committing malfeasance, towing the line isn't enough to differentiate you. It just makes you average. We don't break the law is hardly a compelling reason offer someone a permit. You say, no, we go above and beyond the environmental regulations. The water is going to be cleaner, the noise levels are going to be lower, the amount of emissions are going to be less than we're required to by law. That's far more compelling than we haven't been fined in 5 years.
Yeah, it really is.
And if you're, want to be, want to grow and want to build or want to expand in an area, which message do you think is going to resonate with the local population, not just the regulators or the town council, but how do you get people in favor of you coming into that? They got to buy you before you get a chance to sell them
Yeah.
anything.
Well, and we're seeing that, kind of building on that. We are starting to see this conversation happening a lot and that tension, but with the data center piece, where
Yeah.
we're seeing communities, there's recent stuff going on in Utah, and we've seen it in other places around the country with this tension between the stakeholders, which was, that really key fifth metric that you were talking about, that you've been talking to companies about. Like, but do you find that, like, I say the general public, but like the communities, the stakeholders, and stuff have become a lot more like, I feel like we've got less time to read the news, right? About anything. Everyone just reads headlines and stuff. Like some of these tensions and this, us versus them kind of rhetoric and stuff. Like I'm sort of curious, like that stakeholder management piece and your kind of experience around that. How have you seen that evolve and like where do you think that's going? I don't there's so much to unpack there, but we are seeing some of it happening in real time.
Absolutely. With Lafarge, it was a heavy construction materials company. So, you know, the big equipment, the big loaders, the big, massive equipment for moving large volumes of rock and dirt. The community thinks of them as, big, nasty, snarling dinosaurs until they're snowed in. And then you ask permission, hey, can we come and clear the parking lot and the roads and get the hospital open? And we used to do that. We used to take our biggest trucks that we could run on streets that were street legal, the biggest loaders, and we'd go out there and we'd pick up the snow, clear parking lots. First of all, we took the snow back to our quarry. Why? Because we used the water to hold down dust. So it was actually saving us money on water. It was building a lot of community goodwill because suddenly those beasts were helping the community when the community needed the help. That was a much more direct and immediate than, yes, we're mining the stuff that you're going to use to build your home. But with data centers right now, the argument is we're going to take your water, we're going to increase your electric prices. Oh, and by the way, we may automate you out of a job. How do you like us so far? That's the question is, what is the benefit to the community of having that data center there? Is there a benefit? And how do you balance that? Because yes, that equipment made noise and that equipment was, we're mining rock and digging holes, big holes. And occasionally blasting and setting up vibrations and so forth. So that's the whole idea of balancing versus, and that's why you need that stakeholder engagement, help them understand what is reasonable. Um, One of my favorite examples is a company committed to 50% gender parity on the board of directors. And we committed to it by a certain time frame. And stakeholders, well, why is it going to take you so long? And the answer was because our board members have a certain duration of terms. This is when they were each elected. We can't fire them because they're just men. We can't fire them because of their gender, but we can commit to to look for women when we do replace them, and that's the timeline. If people voluntarily step off the board, or God forbid something happens and someone can't continue their term, then we can do it faster. But this is our estimate of how long it will take following, proper procedures. And when you explain that to people, rather than just expect them to figure it out, or just sit there and say, "Oh, we're doing it for your own good." Well, and so I think if it's a failure of the data center companies that want to put them in, it was very similar to what we experienced trying to put in construction sites, or when a local fast food restaurant tried to put in my neighborhood in Virginia when I lived in Virginia, and they kept saying we're going to hire a certain number of high school and college students from the community, but the real issue was people were afraid that people would go through the drive-through and throw litter on the streets. That's what they didn't want. They didn't want the increased volume of traffic and they didn't want the trash.
Trash.
Right. So what did they do? Oh, we won't put it in a drive-through. We'll solve your problem. Instead of just talking at us and saying, we're going to hire a certain number of your kids, which was good, right?
Which
But
is great,
now
yes. Yeah.
it's great, but listening to the community and understanding what the community considers a priority is more important. And with the data centers, I don't think people understand, yes, there will be jobs to build them and maintain them, but are they really taking jobs away? Are they really taking water? Could a data center, and I don't know the answer to this, find another method of cooling itself that provides heat if you were to build it adjacent, let's say, to the local high school that is struggling, as every school is with its budget, and say, we're going to provide you heat because it's excess heat that we need to get rid of. So instead of, we're gonna use it that way. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know at Sodexo, some of our laundry facilities took the warm water that we used that was coming out of the wash cycle and used it to pre-warm the water going in, so we reduced our cost of natural gas
The
to
electricity
heat the
bill.
water coming in, or
Yeah.
electricity, depending on how we heated
Yeah.
it. But it's those, and yes, there's investment. There is investment in doing this stuff, but the word investment is much more important than the word cost because it much more accurately reflects if you do it right, there is a benefit and it's measurable. And it may take some time, right? And that's one of the issues with quarterly reporting and quarterly return. Sometimes
We're
these things
obsessed
take
with that
longer.
cycle. Yeah. Like, unfortunately,
Well,
things take longer than a quarter. So, um, I the th all of these things kinda tie back to, we were talking at the top about the day-to-day and the metrics, right? Like, going back and actually understanding what the actual true metrics tell you and, like, what the data tells you to understand the right metrics so that you can then tie things to the day-to-day. It does feel like we keep sort of just trying to create like countrywide solutions, yet everything is so local. Like it doesn't matter what you do, you're doing something locally in some community, even if you're a huge multinational company and things like that. So it's such an important piece in this whole conversation and perceptions of everything we do, because everything has an impact in some way, shape, or form.
and that's one of the things with reforestation and offering carbon credits, right? We're going to cut down the trees here, but we're going to plant trees somewhere halfway around the world, and they expect a certain amount of local consciousness. But at Lafarge, we did what we call concurrent reclamation, which is as we worked a quarry, as an area of it became exhausted, we would restore it in real time
That's cool.
rather than wait till the quarry was completely exhausted. And guess what? It saves money because you don't have to truck the stuff
Yeah,
offsite and then buy it later. You're just moving it over. So it changes the cost structure. But then you could go to a community and say, because of all the housing development, what we've noted, and we're working with local conservation groups, that there's less habitat for XYZ species. So when we restore this quarry, we could go back to what it was, or would you prefer something that replaces something that's been lost? And we were putting in a lot of butterfly, large scale butterfly habitats, not small little
that's cool.
community gardens. We're talking big,
Yeah,
on the migratory route of monarch butterflies or migratory birds. And yes, some communities wanted nature parks and paths through it so they could teach their children, and the local school could bring students in and experience the ecosystem. So again, it's about that conversation because the assumption of what matters to people is often where you get tripped up.
it's such an important thing for us to all remember as we're doing these and having these conversations. Like I feel like I said, I so much now is just headlines and what we read in the headlines, and we don't ever really truly have conversations anymore to a certain extent. I don't know. I feel like that has been lost to a certain extent. Um, and so, yeah, I'm really kind of curious as we kind of wrap up, like, how have where do you think the conversation around decarbonization and sustainability and all this sort of stuff is going? And sort of second to that, like, where do you want it to go? What do you want to see kind of, or would you consider a win in that regard, as we sort of think to the future?
Well, this is an evolution, and it's an evolution that's been going on for longer than I've been doing it. As what is expected of a business has evolved. You don't work there for 40 years and get the gold watch and the pension anymore. So the contract has changed. But ideally, we get caught up in our jargon. We get caught up in our words. We get caught up in our acronyms, like every other profession. And my precept is one day we'll just call this business, because in the 21st century, doing what you did in the 1950s isn't good enough anymore to be successful, much less be favored. And so they, big data and AI and things like that are going to be transformational if you can build systems that make it easier to capture this data, collect this data, analyze this data, and understand this data as business intelligence, but also then to use it to communicate with your stakeholders, building trustworthy systems, because trust has really been broken down. People don't trust corporations to do the right thing, but they don't, because why? Experience. People look at the world around them, and the stories, of course, that get the big headlines of the companies that do things wrong, but companies doing things right. And again, not just complying with the law, which I would say is not doing things wrong,
Minimum,
but
minimum.
doing the minimum standard.
Yeah,
In school, that was a C, folks. And would you hire a C student?
it's a really
Would
good
you
analogy.
be satisfied with a C, or do you want the A? Do you want the company that sits there and says, we're going to do more to protect the health and well-being of our employees, our contractors, our customers, and their end users than anyone else in our industry? That's the company you not only want in your community. If I'm an investor, that's the company I would think, well, wait a minute. Unless I'm going to invest quarter by quarter and be a day trader and flip stocks, which by the way leads to bubbles, buy and hold is the model of most investors, and yet we try to satisfy the ones, as we said earlier, quarterly. Um, Building something takes time. And this is one thing I've seen is when I first started talking about this, one out of every $12 was in socially responsible investment funds. This is under professional management in the US. It's now one out of $3, and it's probably going to be close to one out of every $2. That is the largest, and the green economy is the fastest growing sector behind tech in the country. In the country, because we've seen shocks now with the supply of oil like we haven't seen since the 1970s. Remember what we learned then? We didn't want to be beholden to countries and the whim of leaders. I'd much rather be beholden to the whim of things like the sun, because the sunrise and the sunset are pretty predictable. And kilowatt hour for kilowatt hour, uh, solar and renewable electricity is now cheaper than any other form of electricity in the world. And I'll add to it, you don't need to, if you do local on site or distributed systems, you don't have to have these long transmission lines, which are equally tough to permit. That that you can generate the electricity where it's used. Nobody wants a power plant in their backyard to feed someone else. But if you have something small in scale, um, solar panels over alongside roadways or over irrigation canals or in farmland that isn't being used, these things are popping up everywhere. It's easier and faster to permit, much less environmental degradation, and your source is closer to your use. So you're much less vulnerable for things. Even think about a big weather event can take down a transmission line, but if it's, closer to
If
your
it's yeah,
property,
if it's
it's much
close.
less. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so true, and I think the volatility piece is gonna be really interesting to see how that, shifts the dynamic, or if it does shift the dynamic, to be honest. Like, I think it will, in terms of what we'll see around demand destruction. And I've definitely just anecdotally talking to friends, and I was in an Uber on my way to the airport for a trip recently, and the guy was like, "Yeah, I just bought this secondhand EV because I don't want to pay high fuel prices and stuff." So we are starting to see even just individual consumers making different decisions. Because of, yeah, wanting to be a little bit more self-sufficient and a little bit, more immune from global shocks in particularly oil prices, but yeah,
But
other
that's
things as
another
well.
important shift. In the
Mm.
1970s, it was like, save energy, wear a sweater, right? And when comfort and convenience get compromised, people don't like to do it. But if you look at what's going on with EVs right now, back in the 1970s, the best economy cars in terms of mileage also had lower quality and lower safety standards, and people were not going to put their family or themselves in something dangerous or that they'd have to replace very quickly. Well, now let's look at EVs and look at how reliable and safe and all the comfort and convenience items that are in electric vehicles. And suddenly, if you don't have to compromise, you can have it all. And, you don't have to go pay whatever it is at the pump. Uh, and if you have a solar panel, you're actually charging it for free once you've installed. Um, so that that balance has become much less of a stark contrast between the environmental, social, and economic pillars that we each have as a human being as well.
Yeah. No, it really has. It's going to be interesting to see, I think, yeah, like as we kind of move forward, both with all the volatility, but to your point, like rebuilding trust, or even if it's possible to rebuild trust between the general public and corporations. I don't know. That's something that I'm definitely kind of curious to see how it evolves, particularly over the next couple of years here in the US, with the some of the changes to just the way that we're doing business right now and regulatory changes and things like that as well. But um, anyway,
Well, I'll say this: trust is easily is hard fought, won, and easily lost. But I don't often go back to the Greek philosophers, but Socrates said the best way to be perceived is the manner you wish to be perceived is to act in the manner you wish to be perceived. If businesses want to be trusted, they must be trustworthy, and that's the big change they have to learn. Not just put out glossy reports and put out measures. You could say we cut our emissions in half, but if your emissions are terrible, so you have to get to that, what does it really mean? And are you having meaningful impact?
no, John, I think that's a really good place for us to leave that off. I think
Sure.
this has been absolutely fabulous. We've covered so much ground and so much fun things to talk about. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for asking me. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks.